Good morning. We are on Memvav Amud Aleph 46a. And then we're still in a narrow set of lines, and the line begins with the word shanim, and the second word is vikachim. Vikachim delay pasla. Okay, so what are we holding? At this juncture, we're holding at the point that, and this is the main point we're trying to establish, that in this Gzera Shava between Para Aduma and Egla Rufa, it's unilateral, not bilateral. Namely, Para Aduma picks up a law from Egla Rufa, right? Which is the work is expanded beyond yoke. And yet, Egla Rufa does not pick up from Para Aduma to be invalidated or to be disqualified by a blemish. That's where we are. Now, why doesn't the Gzera Shava go both directions? Well, that's because there's ba. Because both of them had a word ba. Both of these laws, the law of expanding work beyond yoke has the word in it, implying that it should not be transferred. And the law of disqualification of blemish by paraduma also has the word ba, implying that it shouldn't be transferred. But the word ba at blemish of paraduma is not being used for anything else, and therefore blocks the transference of the blemish disqualification to Egla Rufa. But the word ba, by the law of Egla Rufa expanding the definition of work beyond yoke, that word ba in it is being tied up to teach us something else. Thus, it is free. Thus, it's tied up, and therefore cannot prevent the transference of the law of expanding the definition of work to paraduma, and therefore it is transferred. Long-winded way of saying that, yeah.
You can't use a Gzera Shava.
You could.
For Egla Rufa.
For Egla Rufa to take from paraduma, no, because the word ba is there.
Right.
But from Egla Rufa to give to paraduma, yes, because the word ba that's there is being used to do something else. What's it being used to do? It's being used to exclude the disqualification of work from carbonos as a whole. In other words, carbonos, even if they've been worked on, are still valid as offerings. They aren't disqualified just because they were once worked on. So you used your cow to plow your field, and the next day you can offer it as a carbon. Makes no difference. Yeah.
And that was learned from a Kalva Homer.
Now, the word ba tells us that the prohibition or the disqualification of work remains within Egla Rufa and does not go to kachim, does not go to carbonis, because there's a word ba. It says in it, work is a disqualifier, but not in others, namely not in carbonis.
Okay.
Right? Now the question is, why would I need a disqualifier? Why would I need a disqualifier? Why would I need a word to disqualify taking the prohibition of Egla Rufa and putting it to carbonis? Why would I think to do that to begin with?
You say yesterday because you may use a Kalva.
Because you may use a Kalva Chaimer. This is where we are. I'm reviewing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Gemara says you may have used the Kalva Chaimer and said, well, Egla Rufa is lenient in that blemish is not a disqualifier. Carbonis is more stringent in that blemish is a disqualifier. And yet, the more lenient one, Egla Rufa, has the disqualifier of work, then should not the more stringent one, Carbonis, also have the disqualifier of work? That's what I would have thought. And thus comes the word ba and says, well, no, the disqualifier of work remains within Egla Rufa, not to be transferred to Carbonis. Right? That's what we said. The word ba stops the Kalva Chaimer rather than stopping a Gzera Shava to paraduma. Yeah. To which the Gemara responded and said, well, hold on, Egla Rufa has another stringency. Right? Your premise is, the premise of your Kalva Chaimer is that Egla Rufa is more lenient because blemish is not a disqualifier, but is it completely universally more lenient? It has other stringency, namely the age factor. Well, the Gemara said, yeah, but there's some karbanos that also have an age factor. And for those, we could have made a kal v'chemer, right?
Right.
Which would mean, if we were to stick with that kal v'chemer, that any carbon that has an age limit must not be worked on. That's what the kal v'chemer would have told me. Extracting from egla rufa, which also has an age limit, and yet is not disqualified by blemish, and yet is disqualified by work, and thus karbonis that have an age factor. And they are disqualified by blemish, how much more so they should be disqualified by work? That's what I would have said. Comes the word ba and says, no, don't transfer the work to karbonis. And because the word ba is tied up, preventing a transference to karbonis, therefore the law is freed to be transferred via gzeir shava to paraduma. That's the whole point of this exercise. Yeah? That's where we are at this point. So the main point here is, going forward, and at the underpinning of this whole thing, is that the word ba that's associated with the disqualification of work for egla rufa is tied up, preventing that law from being transferred to karbanis. And because it's being used to prevent the law being transferred to karbanis, therefore the law may be transferred to paraduma.
Because it is being used to prevent you from using the kal v'chomer.
It's preventing you from using kal v'chomer, and therefore not preventing you from using. So it's tied up in preventing the kal v'chomer, and therefore it's free to do a gzeir shava to transfer to paraduma. But as soon as I can tell you that the word ba is not being used to prevent the kal v'chomer, then it's back to square one, in which it's going to seemingly prevent me from doing the gzeir shava. Right? That's what the Gemara is going to do now. The Gemara is going to tell us.
They're going to say that you can use the kal v'chomer for.
No, what the Gemara is going to tell us is that the fact that work is not a disqualifier by karbonis is not derived from the word ba. It's derived from a different law. And if it's derived from a different law, then the kal v'chomer is not being prevented by the ba. It's being prevented by some other derivation. And if it's already being prevented by something else, then the word ba is free to prevent the gzeir shava. That's the exercise for today. So let's see.
Getting down into the hole here.
Oh, the Gemara is not afraid of going down rabbit holes at all, ever. The Gemara will pursue truth to the end of the earth. Okay. The kachim and karbonis, which are called kachim, right? There are different levels of karbonis. Kachim, kalam, kachim, kachim, but it's kachim. In other words, holy. That is to say, things that are designated to be offered on an altar. Karbonis. The loy pasla buhu avoda, the fact that work done with those animals is not a disqualifier. Mehacha nafka, is that truly derived from the fact that it says ba? Is that what's holding me back from disqualifying karbonis from work? Mehacha nafka, from here it's derived? That's not true. Mehasam nafka, it's derived from elsewhere. The word ba is not responsible for withholding the disqualification. The word ba is not responsible for withholding the disqualification of work from karbonis. Right? It's another verse that's responsible for that. Namely, the verse says like this. It's a verse that lists the blemishes. There's a verse that lists blemishes or types of blemishes that disqualify animals from being used as karbonis. Namely, iveres, oy shavor, oy charutz, oy yabeles, oy garav, oy yalefes. These are different types of blemishes, not all of which I know, but lame, broken, different types of skin diseases or other types of things, warts. So it lists a bunch of them. Iveres is one, oy shavor, or a shavor, oy charutz, yabeles, garav, yalefes. There's a list of different types of blemishes. And then the verse concludes. This is the main point. Lo sakrivu ela Hashem. You shall not offer these to God. These, any animal that carries these types of blemishes. Now, the Gemara analyzes as follows. Why add that word? Lo sakrivu elul Hashem. Don't offer these to Hashem. The word these didn't have to be there. It could have said, Lo sakrivu Hashem. Don't bring to Hashem. List the blemishes. The one who has A, B, C, D, or E, don't offer to Hashem. Why add the word these? Don't offer these to Hashem. So it derives the Gemara, Eile iyat makriv. These are the kinds of issues that prevent you from bringing it as an offering to Hashem. Aval but atamakriv, you may offer kachim, holy offerings, karbanis, shenevde behen avoda, on which work was done. From the fact that the Torah says, that's where it's going. From the fact that the Torah says, these are a disqualifier, i.e. blemishes are a disqualifier. But there are other things that aren't a disqualification, namely work. So now the word ba is free again. How
do you derive work from blemishes?
It's a mute. It's by mute. Which means when the Torah uses a specific term, there's no general term before it. No, there's no general specific term here. It's just by omission, not by omission, not omission really. By mute. I say these, it's coming to disqualify something else or coming to exclude something else. It's an exclusion. So I'm saying these are a disqualification, but there's something else that you might have thought is like a disqualification that isn't, because I'm only saying these are.
Okay.
Right? So what's that other thing? An animal has been worked on. So we already know from the verses that work is not a disqualifying factor in karbanis. And therefore, I don't need the word ba to prevent the kavach chomer coming from egla rufa, because karbanis itself tells you I'm not disqualified by work. And if that's the case, then the word ba is free to prevent the gzera shava of egla rufa taking the definition of work to expand it beyond yoke and then translate that to paraduma. It's being prevented by the word ba, because the word ba is no longer tied up in anything. Yeah. So now back to square one. So the Gemara is going to do is the Gemara is going to parse down to different types of work and say each type of work and each stage of work requires another derivation to tell me that doesn't disqualify a carbon. So let's see. Itzrich, says the Gemara, I still need the word ba, not to prevent universal work as an issue on karbanis, not to generally disqualify, not to generally tell me that work is not a disqualifying factor for karbanis, but for specific type of work, namely salkadai techamina. Again, that word salkadai techamina. Salkadai techamina. I would have thought, had I only had one derivation to tell me that karbanis is not disqualified by work, from that other one, I would have thought as follows: Hani mili, when do these words apply? Meaning, when do I say work is not a disqualifying factor for karbanis? When you did work that was permissible, namely, just regular plowing your field. What if I use that? What if I use that animal to do something, to do work that the Torah prohibits? The examples Rashi gives.
Like on Shabbat or something.
That's what I thought, actually. But Rashi doesn't say that.
Or muzzling it or not muzzling.
Actually, no, that's just this, two examples: Shabbos or kilayim, which is if you were to plow a field, work a field with a donkey and a ox
Another
together.
species.
Cross species, yeah.
Right.
Those are two examples. Shabbos. So now I could have very logically reasoned and said, okay, Torah says that work is not a disqualifying factor for karbanos. Okay, fine. But what if it did something Torah says you can't? Does Hashem want that on his altar? I could have reasoned and said, well, that's a work that is disqualified. But now that I have two derivations to tell me work is not a disqualifying factor, prohibited work. So now that I have two verses that come to tell me that work is not a disqualifier, I have one from the fact that says these are disqualified, and I have the word ba.
Right.
It also tells me that even an animal that did work that was prohibited can also be offered as an altar in the temple. There's a lesson in there. right? We learned this already, that karbonis is about taking the energy of the animal soul that went in the wrong direction and redirecting it toward Hashem. And there's a lesson in here. Even if your energy went into literally prohibited things, it can still be redirected because the energy itself is still good. Understand there's a lesson in this. There's no such thing as too far gone. I misappropriated Hashem's energy. Hashem gave me lots of energy. He gave me an animal soul that's full of energy and full of excitement and life and so on. And I feel like, okay, so if I indulged a little bit, but I didn't cross any lines, now I can offer up to the altar. I can redirect my energy towards Hashem. But if I took my energy and I used it to, God forbid, desecrate, maybe I'm too far gone. Says the Gemara, no. The energy you used, even though you misappropriated and used it for desecration of Shabbos, God forbid, the energy is still purely Hashem's beautiful, good energy, and it can be redirected to the altar. There's a lesson in that.
So you can use an animal
that's correct. That's right. That's right. Even an animal that was used for prohibited work, still be offered on the altar.
And the Rufa teaches us to.
So the word ba teaches us that. By preventing the kal v'chomer through ba, it tells me that it doesn't even disqualify by it. We don't even apply the disqualification of working the prohibited work. In other words, the more derivations I have to tell me that work is not a disqualifier for karbonis, the more I'll expand to the types of work that aren't disqualifiers.
Right.
If I had only one derivation, I would minimize the disqualification to like the most innocuous work. So if I only had one derivation to tell me work is not a disqualifier, I go to the most inconsequential work, which is Salkadaitach.
Well, maybe it only means this.
Exactly. The most minimum version. That's right. The most minimum version.
Broadest.
That's correct.
Lenient.
That's correct.
Position.
The most lenient position. And the most lenient position would be kosher work doesn't disqualify.
Right.
But now that I have an extra derivation, we'll have to expand it more to include even non-kosher work doesn't disqualify it. Okay. But the Gemara is not done yet. Second to last line of the narrow set of lines, second to last word. But this too, I have another derivation to tell me that work is not a disqualifier from karbonis. I already have two. I don't need the word ba, because I already have two.
You have another one?
Yep. Mahacha nafka. This too is derived from somewhere else. Namely, the verse reads, Umiyad ben Nechar, and from the hand of the son of a foreigner. Loi sakrivu, you shall not offer, as lechem elehechem, the bread of your God, meaning the bread of Hashem, the karbonis, mikol ele, from all of these. What's the verse talking about? Let's read it. Let's pull up the pasuk over here. It's on the right hand side of Vayikra, Chav Beis, Chav Hey. 1 second. We'll get the full context. Remember that? Chav Beis, Chav Hey. Vayikra 22, 25. Let's pull it up. Okay, the verse reads. The main point is the word these. No, I got the wrong one. I was on before. 22-25, yeah. Okay, so after the list of blemishes that are disqualifier, it then goes on to say, and from the hand of the Gentile you shall not offer up as food for your God any of these blemished animals, for their injuries upon them, there is a defect on them, they will not be accepted. Okay. Now, in describing this, so it's part of the it's at the end of the list of blemishes, telling us that the law of blemish applies to non-Jew as well. I think that's the point here, right? Because blemishes are an issue even for Jews, even for Jewish karbonis. But then the verse conclusion says even if a non-Jew brings up offering this blemish, it's also an issue, right? I think that's the point.
Which would be in non-kosher animals, maybe.
No, blemish. Just the list of blemishes described earlier.
that wouldn't.
No,
work
no.
because non-kosher meat.
Yeah, so it's okay. Here, there's the point. Rashi explains this for us. The point is like this: that ordinarily, a non-Jew could bring a carbon in his own backyard, even if it's blemished. But if he's going to bring it to the temple, then it has to be blemished. Then it has to be pure, not blemished. So
That verse, right? We already know that.
no, but well, because outside of the temple, a non-Jew is allowed to bring a carbon, and that carbon doesn't have to be unblemished. It could be blemished. So the verse is telling me that, but if they decide to bring that carbon to the temple, then it has to be unblemished.
Okay,
Right.
okay, super.
That's the point. So we're expanding. The Torah is expanding the law of the blemished, of the disqualification of blemish on a carbon to non-Jews as well that are bringing a carbon to the temple. Now the point is that the Torah does that. The Torah uses the word Ela again. These again didn't have to use the word these. These thus applies that these are an issue, but others are not an issue.
This verse is supposed to tell us that
That the-
prohibited work is
No. One second. This verse is supposed to tell us that the disqualification of blemish applies to non-Jews. But the word these, or you're asking about the word these?
I'm asking about
The simple plain meaning of the verse?
The Gemara is countering and saying,
Okay, yes.
there's another
verse.
reason we can derive that
That work is not a disqualifier.
Prohibited work is
That work is not a disqualifier. So the more derivations I have that tell me work is not a disqualifier, the more I'll expand the definition of which work is not a disqualifier.
Okay.
Right? So far we only had two.
Well,
The word Ela, these, in describing after the list of blemishes.
Yeah.
And then we had another one, ba. Now the Gemara is telling me is a third one, which is the second time the Torah uses the same word Ela in describing the blemishes. And
to argue that we don't need the
we don't need the ba to tell me that work is not a disqualifier.
Right.
Because the Kabbalas themselves already have twice the word Ela to do that.
To try to knock out the Gezerah
That's right.
Shavah.
That's correct. That's correct.
All right, no.
That's correct. So the Gemara, this is how the Gemara says it. So Ela, the verse says, these, iyatamakir, if you don't offer, these as in these animals that have blemishes, atamakir, but you are welcome to offer, kachim, designated animals for karbanis, shenevde behen avoda, that work was done with it. And because I have two verses that tell me that work is not an issue, and these two verses are within the laws of karbanis themselves, in describing the blemishes. Twice it says, these blemishes are an issue. But other things like work is not an issue. Twice it says it. It's the implication of the word these, because it says twice, these are an issue. These blemishes are a disqualifier. Therefore, other things are not disqualifier. Namely, work is not a disqualifier. And because that's twice, I'll say once teaches me that kosher work is not a disqualifier. And the second time teaches me that non-kosher work is not a disqualifier. And therefore, the word ba, by Egla Rufa is free, and therefore should prevent the Gezerah Shavah from being transferred to Paraduma. To which the Gemara says, no, I still need it. I have a third level of work that needs to be identified as not a disqualifier. How's that? Again, that word, Salkadaitach, I would have thought Amina to say, had I only had two disqualifications or two words that exclude work as a disqualifier.
What's left?
Hanimili, I would have said these words only apply. Heicha, when the avad behen, when you did the work, kishein chulin, while the animals are still mundane. Meaning,
they weren't consecrated.
They weren't consecrated yet. So I own an animal, I have an ox, and I've been using it to plow my field. And one day I decided to offer it as an altar, as an offering to Hashem.
You had the intent.
So now I designated it. So right now, even though it's not on the altar yet, it's been designated for the altar. There's all kinds of laws that apply to that. As it belongs now to Hashem, it's been consecrated. Now at this point, because I did work yesterday, I already know work is not a disqualifier. I know that from these two verses, whether the work yesterday was on Shabbos, God forbid, or whether the work was kosher work. I already know it's not an issue because twice the Torah says, these blemishes are an issue, but not work.
Right.
But now that I consecrated it, what happens if tomorrow morning I work on it? Is that a problem? But what if I worked on them once I've already consecrated them? I might suggest,
it wouldn't be a problem.
Listeru, they should become disqualified. So therefore, says the Gemara, therefore I need a third a third derivation.
That's fine.
And thus, the word ba is tied up.
You have to find ways to tie it up because their shava has to work.
Now you're understanding the Gemara's reverse engineering.
Yeah.
The Gemara already has the conclusion.
That's already the conclusion.
It has to go back to the verse and make it work. We already have the conclusion that there's a Gzera Shava that tells me that the definition of work by paraduma goes beyond yoke.
Right.
And I know that comes from Egla Rufa. But I have this word ba there that seems to be preventing it. So I need to figure out why that ba is being used. And what were the sages thinking when they gave us that conclusion in the Mishnaic texts? Us in the Gemara in Babylonia, 100 years later, need to figure out why we've been left with this conclusion. So we have to reverse engineer using these rules and say, well, this is what they must have been thinking. And this concludes this rabbit hole. We'll go down other ones, God forbid. We'll go down other ones with Hashem's help. But this concludes the whole thing. And in conclusion, we have like this. Like to sum up the whole story. And this is the main point. Blemish is not a factor by Egla Rufa. Why is it not a factor by Egla Rufa when seemingly I should be pulling it from paraduma, considering that there's a Gzera Shava? Answer, because when the Torah disqualifies blemish from paraduma, it says in it. And therefore, only it has a disqualification of blemish, not to be transferred to Egla Rufa. Then the question becomes, well, if that's the case, why isn't paraduma, or now, how is it that paraduma is disqualified by work beyond yoke? When the verse says only yoke is a prohibiting type of work for paraduma. Why am I expanding the definition? Well, because it says by paraduma, it says by Egla Rufa that it goes beyond yoke. Why are you transferring? The word ba is there to prevent it. Oh, because the word ba is tied up. Where's the word ba tied up? Because when it comes to karbonis, there are 3 levels of work that you might have thought would disqualify a carbon from being offered to Hashem. And each level of work that you might have thought could be disqualifier must be prevented by a verse. Number 1, there are 3 types of work. Number 1, kosher work. Number 2, prohibited work. Number 3, work done after it became consecrated. And I have 3 derivations. Eile, ba. These said twice with regard to blemishes by a carbon, where it says these are disqualified, but not work as a disqualification. Those 2, plus the 3rd one is the word ba of Egla Rufa. Now, why would I think to begin with, or why would I have thought that work should become a disqualifier? That's the Kavol Chemer I would have applied from Egla Rufa. I would have applied a Kavol Chemer from Egla Rufa telling me that just as if Egla Rufa is lenient in that blemish is not an issue, and yet work is an issue, when it comes to karbonis, where blemish is an issue, how much more so work should be an issue? Certainly the kinds of karbonis that are limited by age, just like Egla Rufa is limited by age, certainly those karbonis should have a disqualifying factor of work. And thus comes the 3 verses, the 3 extra derivations, to prevent all kinds of work from being a disqualifying factor by karbonis. And therefore, the word ba is tied up. And because the word ba is tied up to prevent work from being a disqualifier at karbonis, therefore the law to expand the definition of work beyond yoke is freed to be transferred to paraduma via Gzera Shava. That's the conclusion.
Right.
Tomorrow, the Gemara is going to go down a different route, which is, we haven't really fully analyzed this idea that the definition of work in paraduma is expanded beyond yoke, especially considering there's actually a difference. When it comes to paraduma, it's even if you placed the work object on the animal. It's more strict. When it comes to Egla Rufa, it's more lenient in the sense that it's only when you've pulled it. So how do we make all that work out? And what's the system by which we make that derivation?
That was through the Gzera Shava, you take
Okay, right. So I did that because the Gemara is relying, in other words, the Gemara is only using that here to settle the fact that Egla Rufa is not disqualified by paraduma.
Yes, no, I understand.
Sorry, not disqualified by blemish. But now that the Gemara raised that issue, the Gemara is going to say, okay, gufa. Now getting back to what you mentioned earlier about the derivation of expanding this definition of work by paraduma, let's go analyze that for a second now. In other words, the Gemara put a pin in it, having raised the issue in context of Egla Rufa's non-disqualification by blemish. Now the Gemara is going to get back to it, which is not an uncommon pattern in the Gemara. The Gemara will raise something in the context of something else just to make its point, and then once it makes its point, we'll go back to what it raised as an issue to begin with. Exactly. To reopen that thing. So that, God willing, coming tomorrow. A wonderful day, Eden.